Hello, I'm Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, continuing to try to build the channel. I've been hovering in the mid-20s now for probably a couple weeks. It is week 25, so next week will mark the half-year anniversary of the channel. I'm a little bit excited about that. This is one of those things that I've actually stuck with. So I usually do a lot of pilot stuff, so this is kind of just one of those things that has worked. But I'm always thankful for everybody that subscribes and follows, and as a Friday video, I'm here to deal with comments. And I have to, there's not too many of them, but there's one that actually didn't realize they were being, they didn't really leave a comment. They left me a video, and I've had these kind of comments before, and so I want to address the subject today of how church service keeps you indoctrinated. Okay. Sorry, I'm a little dry. It's just really hot and my throat's dry for some reason. But so one of the things that church services do is they reinforce things that can't be proven. Now, the reason this comment was significant, and I think the Free Beard of Reason also responded to it, and his response to the video was something to the effect of nothing to say, you just sharing a YouTube link doesn't do a thing. And that's the real point of it. I think a lot of apologetics does the same thing. There's a great deal of appeal to emotion. I led church services for 20 years as a pastor. When I would put together a service, I had several things on my mind, and not very much of it had to do with truth. For about half of that time, I had a very liturgical set order to the service, which I liked for a lot of reasons as a pastor, because it meant that I didn't have to come up with new, interesting things. I simply had to put different things in different slots. Like I'd had the same set spot for a hymn, the same set spot for offering, the same set spot for, in my last church, we pledge allegiance to the American flag and the Christian flag, and so on and so forth. I often remark that it felt like children's church for grown-ups, because that's what I did when I was a kid. But what a church service is designed to do is it's designed to invoke emotion. It's designed to use symbolism, and it's designed to use music. It's designed to, preaching is largely rhetoric. It's designed to bring forth certain emotions that cause a reinforcement of what is said as true. It's been said that you can get somebody to act more on their passions than you can ever convince somebody by logic and reason. I would find that true. When I was a Pentecostal preacher, I could most definitely use music and my preaching to emotionally charge people up to go do whatever. And that was the real problem with it, because it was just, I began to realize that there wasn't a lot of quote-unquote truth to what I was doing, so much as experientially people were experiencing things. Now, people in liturgical churches don't seem to realize they're doing this too. There's the old argument, well, we don't do that newfangled, Christian rock and roll. We're going to do the old hymns. And I used to laugh at this, because every one of the hymns in my hymn book at one point was a new song, and it was a good chunk of them were criticized for their musical content. Martin Luther's probably a good one, because A Mighty Fortress Is Our God is a classic German bar song tune, and he just changed the words. And I am fairly certain back in the 1500s when he did that, he caught holy hell, quite literally, for that. And, but that's the nature of the beast. And so people argue about these things, and they go back to their childhood. I think a lot of people like services that are more akin to what they're used to when they were a child. And that's why it calls them back to things, an emotional attachment. The people that stay with faith the longest tend to have very good parents. They tend to have very compassionate churches that raise them up in this stuff through Sunday school and good teaching, whatever, and then reinforce that the rest of their lives through music, through the service, through the nature of the preaching. And I'm going to tell you, I didn't really get good responses to my preaching until I moved it over into a more emotional state. Being a somewhat intellectual Christian at the time, I would push it to be, okay, this is the truth. How do I emotionally convey this truth so that people will not only accept it as truth, but also be motivated to act on it? Preaching is about getting people to act. The problem with that is you end up invoking a lot of emotion, and some of the quote-unquote truth that you're trying to get people to follow, not really all that true. It's just what you perceive to be true. And some of it's just straight up fairy tales that you're just reinforcing. And so you have this design of a service, various elements in it, that try to appeal to all the senses of a human being. Now, there are more than the five senses. I think a lot of people think atheists just believe in what the five senses tell us. There's other senses besides the five. I think one of them is a sense of motion. A sense of motion isn't about what you hear or see or smell or taste or feel. It's more of an inner ear issue. The sense of self is also a sense. So there's other senses besides the five. I think there's 10 or 11 of them. I don't recall them off the top of my head. But what I do understand is the more of these senses that you invoke in a service, the more people emotionally attach to that service. That's why music is used. And right now music videos are used a lot in churches, particularly the modern ones, where they'll play the song and they'll have it on the overhead, and there's some sort of background in the background playing for that song. Drama, other things like that are often used in service. I use drama even in my liturgical church, and people thought those were the best services when I would play a bit of local character. The problem is, one of the last times I did that, I did a thing called Witnesses of Christ, and I realized after I had done it and I did some more digging and more research on the characters that I played, that I was kind of wrong in the portrayal and that there was still some holes in the story of Jesus. It's a lot of things that happen there, but my whole goal of any service was to invoke as much emotion as possible. Like one of the things that's common in most religious services, for instance, lighting of candles. Lighting of candles engages at least three of the senses. One, there is a tactile sense. If you're the person actually lighting the candle, you're holding the light and then you're lighting up the candle. That's all a very visual thing, a very touch-oriented thing. Then when the candle lights, there's a visual component of the light, but there's also heat. And that's more of a touch-based thing. And then any good candle gives off a smell. A lot of other churches will use incense to make. I remember talking to a pretty liturgical person at seminary, and he said one day we walked into chapel, and he told me what time of year it was based on the scent of the incense. He literally one time closed his eyes a couple weeks later and walked in. And I asked him, have we changed from one liturgical season to another? He says, well, hold on. He closed his eyes, put his hands over them, walked into the church and took a sniff. He said, yep, because we've changed the smell of the incense. He literally could figure this out. If you have taste. Now, look at your average service if there's communion, for instance. If there's a communion service, you will literally hit every one of the senses, and that resonates emotionally with different people all the time. I used to have people talk about the service all the time. A lot of people like the music because they're more auditory oriented and verbal as well, auditory, verbal kind of people. Then there were other people that loved communion because they were taste, smell-oriented people, and symbolism is a very visual component. And so when somebody sends me a video as some way of getting me back to faith, I'm going to tell you straight, I consider it manipulative. I know what what that does, it reinforces untruth through the manipulation of senses and sensory data. It is nothing more than symbolism on steroids. And symbolism doesn't prove a damn thing is true. It just reinforces whatever message is in there. If, in a Pentecostal sense, they used to invoke people to a point where they would enter, very weird spiritual states where they would just, they would speak in tongues, they'd fall over, they would do all kinds of stuff. And I used to think that that was proof of the power of God until I read a book on how you can do that with any group of people if you psychologically manipulate them and attach yourself into their emotional state and what they value the most. It's easy to get Christian believers that are already susceptible to the belief in spiritual gifts to think that they're dealing with one. And so that's I wanted to respond to that kind of comment that way, but I also want to say one more thing. You're not going to convince me with that kind of shit. Okay, don't be offended at my language, but I'm going to get downright brutal with people that want to send me videos thinking that, if you just feel Jesus again. I feel much of the same euphoria that I used to feel in the artificially created services where people's emotions were ginned up in Pentecostalism or religious nonsense, whatever, as I do when I have sex. Okay, the emotional endorphins are exactly the same. And you literally could, and some people have, turned sex into a religious experience. There's a reason why, cults try to control your sex life and they can try to control your money. Church, as a general rule, does that already. That's why some atheists will claim that all religions are cults, and I would argue maybe not so. I think all religions are cultic. They use cultic symbolism. I remember laughing my ass off once when I heard a pastor saying he wasn't liturgical. And I started laughing, and he says, dude, I've been to your, and I responded, I've been to your service 3 times. You do the exact same thing in the exact same order. You may not have it on a program or a piece of paper, but you still have a liturgy, okay? You still follow an order of service. And, we are creatures of habit, and that's just the way it is. There's nothing wrong with that. But sitting there somehow saying you're superior because you don't have a liturgy when you do the same bloody thing week after week after week, yeah, you have a liturgy, whether it's written down or not. But you need to understand that religious services are designed to manipulate your emotions to a point where, in my case, I always wanted everybody to sing the songs, do the prayers, repeat after me, light the candles, whatever else we were doing that day. And we did all of that so that they could hear my message, because at that point I put people in an emotional state where they really love the music, love what's going on, and hear things. And then I come out and I preach in such a way that I, try to reach into heartstrings, and I try to reach into the recesses of people's emotions and get them to respond, and then, hopefully give them the truth. I was very conscientious of giving people the truth. But once I realized that the entire gospel message was probably made up, that became harder and harder and more difficult. And of course, I've talked about that in many other deconversion issues. But you need to understand that music and visuals with music are manipulative. People can manipulate people with them and do every Sunday. Other comments, dealing mostly with the life of Christ, talking about Jesus being left behind at age 12. Why didn't the parents, at least check in on him before they left? And why didn't Jesus, being the responsible son that he's supposed to be and being obedient to them, why didn't he check in with his parents? Why does he have to say this cryptic line of, did you not know I needed to be about my father's business? The answer to that question is obviously no, they didn't. Okay, they're not like you, Jesus, who's God on earth, supposedly. They don't have omniscience, so they need you to communicate with them. It does kind of illustrate to me one of the great problems with God, his silence. Well, but the Bible speaks. No. The Bible is written by men about God. It doesn't really record God's words unless it says, and God said. And even then, there's no evidence for that, just some books saying so. So one of the great problems with this is it kind of illustrates the fact that God assumes that we should know something. And that sets people up because, God didn't come through for me. I guess God, I knew what I needed to do. I just didn't see it at the time. And God saw it. And we start making excuses for God that are us. If eternal life is so important and us getting to heaven is so important and God loves all of us and God knows what will convince all of us that he is real and that we should follow him, then if we don't, that means he didn't act on that knowledge. And he, therefore, is responsible for us going to hell. That's the problem with being omniscient or omnipotent in the classical sense. As I've said before, as an open theist, I played with those definitions quite often. But then I realized the very act that I was playing with definitions means that God didn't make any sense in general as a general rule. So, yeah, when I look at this story, though, it's weird because apparently Jesus knew he was the Son of God at age 12. His parents don't seem overly concerned about the fact that he might be missing. I mean, are you supposed to watch over this kid? Aren't you supposed to be a good steward of him? I mean, really, you could criticize the story both directions. Either they're being irresponsible parents or Jesus is straight up irresponsible and unresponsive to people's feelings until after the fact. Either way, it's kind of shit. And it could be both. So, yesterday's video, when I was talking about the end of part 3 and working into part 4, I certainly find it interesting these Gospels lined up this way and getting a better understanding than I already have, and I look forward to the next episode. I used to read the Bible memorizing verses, which when I look back was very dishonest to myself. Religion poisons everything. Now where have I heard that before? Yeah, Christopher Hitchens was famous for that. I remember when I first read that book as a believer, I really tried to disprove it, and I just couldn't. There was just so much truth in it. And eventually, Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and several others were very instrumental in my ideology change, part of deconversion. It's the emotional part that I've had more difficulty with because I'm just not an overly good person with emotions. I can read them really well. I have good empathy, but holy shit, dealing with my own is sometimes very difficult. And so I often just shut down. But when I look at this of how religion poisoned my life, it's when you can't see that something is a fantasy and you're just maintaining it because you need to maintain the fantasy. And you come to that realization, you realize that religion has poisoned your life and stolen a lot of your time, talent, and treasure. And, you really need to, reevaluate what you need to be doing with your life at that point. And I was kind of thankful for a few other things that come along. But when you look at the Gospels in this particular way that I'm looking at them, my interest in this, as I said, is to continue to look at the simple, problem of, do we really have 2 or 3 witnesses? Do we really have that? And so far, no, we don't. And I don't know, I'm going through this pretty much live as we do it. Every time you see our video, you need to realize I probably looked at it for a day or 2 ahead of time before that video. And the reason I'm looking at it is I'm like, do I really have 2 or 3 witnesses? Do Christians really have a case there? And so far they don't. Certainly the early life of Jesus doesn't have a case. And, it's basically one person or the other telling the story, and they never really overlap that much. The events are just way different. So yeah, and thanks for the comment about that series, because I think that's, when I get finished with that and everybody hears that it's been finished, I think that's probably going to be one of my better series on this channel. And I may eventually go back and redo it, just kind of redo the videos one at a time and just kind of do them better, or maybe just edit them. But it's just been one of those series that has allowed me to deconvert and use some of the skills that I gained as a minister and now turn them on their head a little bit. And so I appreciate the comments on that, because we do need to kind of retake a look at this, because there's a lot of people that believe these stories and base their life decisions on them. And I don't really think, I think it's as foolish as basing your life decisions on something that Harry Potter said, or, Samwise and Frodo said. Really, you need to start looking at your ethics and your morals from the standpoint of what benefits yourself and the people around you. Well, I want to thank you once again for stopping by. This has been the Week 25 video, and I appreciate all of you that have subscribed and been here for this channel. I'm very realistic about these things. I know I'm kind of in a niche market, so I don't really expect to make a lot of money at this. Maybe when I hit 100 subscribers, I may Patreon this thing a little bit and see what happens, but that's not why I do this. I want you to hear a perspective of somebody who's been there, who's been a pastor, who is a Bible scholar, who is somebody looking at the text with new eyes. And I think that's something that is very important to do. And, in the process, hopefully I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, the Rabid Atheist, wishing you a good day. And I hope you all are being happy and staying safe.